Welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're taking you to the Philippines
Oh,
to unpack a case
okay.
that's all about fairness representation and those little things we call votes.
Right.
We're talking about the 2021 Supreme Court decision
Okay.
in ANGKLA versus COMELEC,
Wow.
which grapples with how a country tries to make its elections work for everyone.
Yeah, and this isn't just about the Philippines.
Right.
It really gets at, I think, some questions about how electoral systems around the world try to balance the voice of the majority with the needs of the minority.
Exactly. And we've got excerpts from the Supreme Court decision itself, including those fascinating dissenting opinions. So, we're going deep on this one.
Oh, very cool.
But first, a little context.
Yeah.
The Philippine party list system, now most of us are used to the idea of voting for an individual in our district, right?
Right.
But the party list system is different.
Okay.
It's designed to give a voice in Congress to marginalized groups who might not win in those traditional district-based elections.
Interesting.
Think farmers' workers, indigenous communities,
Right.
groups whose concerns deserve a seat at the table, even if they don't have the same voting power as larger segments of the population.
Makes sense.
Okay.
It's a way to try and ensure that the legislature actually reflects the, diverse makeup and interests of the entire nation.
Okay, so that's the goal. But here's where things get complicated.
Okay.
There's this ongoing debate about how these party list seats are actually awarded and whether it truly achieves that goal of fair representation.
Okay.
And that's where ANGKLA versus COMELEC comes in. The petitioners in this case, they argued that the way the system was awarding additional seats was actually diluting the votes of smaller parties and giving an unfair advantage to the larger ones.
So essentially they claimed it was undermining the very purpose the party list system was created for.
And get this, the court ultimately upheld the existing system, which uses something called the Banat Formula,
Okay.
but not without some pretty strong words from several justices.
Oh, really?
We're talking multiple dissenting opinions, each with their own take on how to make this whole thing fairer.
Wow.
So buckle up,
Okay.
because we're about to unpack why a group of judges couldn't agree on the fairest way to count votes and what that says about the challenges of designing a truly representative democracy.
And what's so fascinating about this is that there's no easy answer. There's no mathematical formula that can perfectly balance all these competing values and interests.
Yeah.
It forces us to confront some fundamental questions about representation, fairness, and what it truly means to have a voice in a democracy.
Okay, so before we get into those dissenting opinions,
Okay.
because trust me, they're worth a deep dive of their own,
I believe it.
we've got to break down this Banat formula, right? It's kind of like the electoral engine that's driving this whole debate.
Right.
So the Banat formula,
Okay.
it's a two-round system
Right.
that on the surface might not sound too complicated,
Right.
but it gets surprisingly nuanced.
I see. It's like a dance, really, with these intricate steps for allocating seats.
Okay.
And as with any good dance, it's all about the balance.
I love that analogy. Okay, so picture this. Round one. We've got all our party list contenders lined up on the dance floor, ranked by how many votes they got.
Right.
And if a party manages to snag at least 2% of the total votes cast for all party lists,
Yep.
boom, they lock in a guaranteed seat in Congress.
It's like getting that rose on a competition show.
Yeah.
You're safe at least for now.
Mm.
This 2% threshold is meant to ensure a party has a certain level of nationwide support.
Right, you've got to demonstrate you've got some serious backing.
Right.
Now, round two is where things get really interesting,
Right.
and where ANGKLA versus COMELEC really heats up.
Right.
This is when those additional seats come into play.
Okay.
The ones that spark the whole debate about fairness.
And this is where those dance steps get a little trickier.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So after those guaranteed seats are handed out, we've got some seats left over right. The second round of the Banat formula takes those remaining seats and divides them up proportionally
Okay.
based on, get this, the total votes each party received.
And that includes parties that didn't even hit that initial 2% threshold.
Right. So even if a party didn't get a guaranteed seat, they still get to compete for these additional seats.
Exact.
And this, my friend, is a major point of contention.
Right, because the argument against this,
Yeah.
which is what the petitioners in ANGKLA versus COMELEC are saying,
Right.
is that it creates a bit of a lopsided playing field.
Okay.
Larger parties, because they have a wider base of support to begin with,
Yeah.
are more likely to rack up more votes overall.
Right.
Even if a smaller party's supporters were more dedicated, they showed up to vote specifically for their party.
Yeah, it's almost like saying every vote isn't quite equal because a vote for a larger party ends up carrying more weight in that second round.
Exactly.
And that's what those dissenting opinions really dig into.
It's about the weight and the meaning we assign to a single vote and how those votes translate to representation.
Now, remember those dissenting opinions we mentioned?
Yes.
They weren't just disagreeing for the sake of disagreeing.
Okay.
Each justice who dissented in this case, they brought their own perspective on what a fair and representative system should look like and how they felt the Banat Formula was falling short.
And it's in these dissenting opinions that we really start to see the complexity of this issue come alive.
Yes.
And how even legal experts can have very different interpretations of fairness.
Right, because it's not like there's one magical formula that everyone agrees on. So let's start with Chief Justice Gizmundo.
Okay.
He had some major concerns about the way the Banat Formula seemed to double count votes.
I see.
Remember how we talked about those guaranteed seats being allocated first?
Right.
Well, he pointed out that the formula then uses those same votes again when it comes to divvying up the additional seats. His point was, if a vote has already been used to secure a guaranteed seat for a party, should it really be counted again in the second round?
Interesting.
It raises the question of whether all votes should be treated equally at every stage of the allocation process.
Right, or if that's even possible.
And Chief Justice Gizmundo wasn't alone in his concerns.
Okay.
Justice Kagiyoa, for example, he took a different approach altogether. He basically said, look, this whole two-round thing is needlessly complicated. Let's keep it simple.
He argued that a simpler system would be easier for voters to understand, which could lead to greater trust and confidence in the electoral process.
Exactly. So his solution, ditch the two-round system entirely. Just rank all the parties, big and small, from highest to lowest based on their total votes, and allocate the seats in that order, keeping in mind the 3-seat cap for any single party.
It's an elegant solution in its simplicity.
Yeah.
And it really highlights his focus on transparency and voter comprehension.
Right.
Yeah.
No confusing calculations, just straight up vote totals.
Exactly.
But the plot thickens.
Okay.
Justice Alameda, he came to the table with his own alternative formula.
Interesting.
Now, his approach was a bit more complex. It involved adjusting the votes of those parties that already secured seats in the first round to account for those seats in the second round.
So he was essentially trying to find a way to acknowledge the mandate of those larger parties that earned a significant portion of the vote, while still ensuring that the system didn't completely drown out the voices of the smaller, more niche parties.
So it's still trying to strike that balance.
Exactly.
But then we get to Justice Lopez.
Okay.
And he brought a whole other layer of complexity to the table.
Okay.
While he agreed with some aspects of the Banat Formula, he raised some serious red flags about how those additional seats were being assigned at the very end of the process.
Okay.
See, the way it worked was that parties were essentially awarded those remaining seats based on their ranking in the initial list, not necessarily on whether they had more votes overall.
And he argued that this could lead to a situation where a party with fewer total votes might actually end up with more seats than a party that received more votes overall.
Wow.
Simply because of the order in which the seats were allocated.
Which, let's face it, feels a little counterintuitive when you're talking about an election, right?
It raises the question of whether the final allocation of seats accurately reflects the overall will of the electorate, or if it creates a distortion based on this somewhat arbitrary ranking system.
Yeah, and how do you even measure
the
will of the electorate? It's fascinating how even within the court itself, there were such diverse opinions on the best way to approach this. Okay, we've thrown a lot of names and numbers at you.
It's a lot.
Let's take a step back for a second.
Sure.
Because you might be wondering what this all means for, well, you.
Right.
So you've got this system that's supposed to be all about making sure everyone's voice is heard. But as we've seen, it's sparked some serious debate about what fairness really looks like in practice.
And that's the thing about electoral systems.
Yeah.
There's no one-size-fits-all solution.
Right.
Every system, every formula comes with its own set of trade-offs.
It's like trying to solve a really complicated puzzle.
Exactly.
You might get some pieces to fit, but then another piece pops out of place.
It's about finding that balance between those competing values, proportionality, simplicity, and ensuring that those who are often marginalized get a real chance to participate in the political process.
And that's where you come in, dear listener.
Right.
What do you think?
Yeah, after hearing all of this, after really unpacking this case and all these different perspectives within it, What stands out to you? What resonates with your own sense of fairness?
It's so easy to just skim headlines about court cases, right?
Absolutely.
But when you actually listen to this
Right.
and you dig into the details,
Yeah.
especially those dissenting voices,
Yeah.
it makes you realize how complex these issues really are.
And how important it is to think critically about the systems that shape our democracies.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive into ANGKLA versus COMELEC, we want to leave you with a final thought.
Okay.
Imagine you're tasked with designing a party list system from scratch. Where would your priorities lie? How would you balance the desire for a system that's easy to understand with the need to ensure that it truly represents the diversity of voices within a society?
It's a question worth pondering.
It is.
Because at the end of the day, we all have a stake in creating a system where everyone feels like their voice matters.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah, thank you.
Until next time, keep asking those tough questions.